Use a warm, empathetic Tonian acquired Tuesday morning in late September. Dr. Emma Thompson carefully backed her small blue car out of her driveway. The autumn leaves were just beginning to turn golden, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of morning coffee from the houses round her neighborhood. Emma had lived in Willowbrook for 8 years now, ever since she accepted her position at the university. She loved the peaceful streets and friendly neighbors who always waved when she passed by. Emma was a constitutional law professor who had dedicated the last 15 years of her life to teaching young minds about justice and fairness. Her students often said she had a gift for making complex legal concepts easy to understand. She believed deeply that the law should protect everyone equally, regardless of their background or appearance. This Tuesday morning, she was heading to her office early to prepare for her afternoon lecture on civil rights as she drove through the tree-lined streets toward the university. Emma noticed how beautiful the neighborhood looked in the morning light. The expensive houses sat behind perfectly manicured lawns, and children waited at bus stops with their colorful backpacks. Emma always drove carefully through these residential areas, especially mindful of the speed limit, because she knew children might be playing nearby. She glanced at her speedometer and saw she was driving 23 miles per hour in a 25-mile-per-hour zone. Emma had always been a cautious driver, having learned from her father, who used to say that patience on the road keeps everyone safe. She was thinking about her upcoming lecture when she noticed the blue lights flashing in her rearview mirror. Emma's heart immediately began to race, but she took a deep breath and pulled over to the side of the road. She checked her speedometer again, confused because she knew she had been driving well within the speed limit. Still, she remained calm and cooperative. Just as her parents had taught her many years ago, she turned off her engine and placed her hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. Officer Collins approached her window with a stern expression on his face. He was a tall man with graying hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to look right through her. He wore his uniform with authority, and his hand rested casually on his belt as he walked toward her car. "License and registration," he demanded in a sharp voice, barely making eye contact with Emma. His tone was harsh and impatient, as if he had already decided she was guilty of something. "Of course, officer," Emma replied politely, her voice steady. Despite her racing heart, she reached slowly for her purse, making sure her movements were clear and deliberate. "May I ask what this is about? I was watching my speed very carefully." Officer Collins shifted his weight and crossed his arms. "You were driving suspiciously through this neighborhood," he said, his tone becoming even sharper. "What's your business here? This isn't exactly your usual area, is it?" Emma felt that familiar weight settling in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced many times before. It was the weight of being judged not by her actions, but by assumptions about who she was and where she belonged. She had experienced this before in department stores, restaurants, and even at professional conferences, the assumption that she didn't belong in certain places simply because of how she looked. "I work at the university," Emma explained calmly, handing over her documents. "I drive through this neighborhood every morning on my way to my office. I've been taking this route for years." But Officer Collins seemed unconvinced. He examined her license for a long time, looking back and forth between the document and her face as if he suspected it might be fake. "University? How?" he said with skepticism in his voice. "What do you do there exactly?" "I'm a professor," Emma replied, maintaining her respectful tone. "I teach constitutional law." Officer Collins raised an eyebrow and continued to study her license. Emma could see doubt in his eyes, as if he couldn't quite believe that she could be a university professor. The silence stretched on uncomfortably as he walked back to his patrol car, presumably to run her license through the system. When he returned, Emma decided to ask a simple question, Officer. I'm still not clear on what traffic violation I committed. Could you please explain what I did wrong? This seemed to irritate Officer Collins even more. His face reddened slightly, and he straightened his shoulders. Are you questioning my authority? He asked defensively. I don't need to explain myself to you. You were driving suspiciously, and that's enough. Emma realized that her calm, reasonable question had somehow been interpreted as a challenge. She watched as Officer Collins began writing additional charges on his citation pad, his pen moving quickly across the paper. She knew that asking questions was her right, but she also understood that this situation was escalating unnecessarily. I'm adding a charge for questioning authority and failure to comply with officer instructions, he said as he tore the citation from his pad. Emma accepted the citation with grace, knowing that arguing further would only make things worse. She had learned long ago that sometimes the best response to injustice was patience and proper legal channels. As she drove away, Emma felt the familiar sting of injustice, but she also felt determined. She had dedicated her career to fighting for fairness, and now she would have to fight for herself. Use a warm, empathetic tone 3 weeks after receiving her citation. Emma stood outside the municipal courthouse on a cold Wednesday morning. The old brick building looked imposing against the grey October sky, with its tall columns and heavy wooden doors that had welcomed countless people seeking justice over the decades. Emma had been inside this courthouse many times before, but always as a law professor bringing students for educational visits. Today, she was here as a defendant, and the feeling was completely different. Emma had spent the previous evening preparing her defense with the same care she put into preparing her university lectures. She had gathered evidence, printed out traffic reports, and even obtained witness statements from neighbors who had seen her driving that morning. Her briefcase contained photographs of the street signs, documentation of the speed limit, and a detailed timeline of events. She believed that truth and preparation would lead to justice, just as she taught her students. As she walked through the courthouse doors, Emma noticed the familiar sounds of the legal system at work. Lawyers whispered with their clients in the hallways. Court clerks hurried past with stacks of files, and families waited nervously on wooden benches. The marble floors echoed with footsteps, and the high ceilings made every sound seem more important. Judge William Hayes was already at his bench when Emma entered the courtroom. He was a man in his early 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that he constantly adjusted while reading documents. Judge Hayes had served on the bench for 15 years and was known throughout the county for his strict approach and quick decisions. He prided himself on running an efficient courtroom and often boasted that he could clear his daily docket faster than any other judge in the district. Emma took a seat in the back of the courtroom and watched as Judge Hayes worked through his morning cases. She observed how he handled each defendant, noting that he rarely looked up from his papers and seemed to make decisions based primarily on the police reports. Most cases were resolved in less than 2 minutes, with defendants either pleading guilty or receiving quick sentences. When the clerk called out Emma Thompson versus the state, Emma felt her heart begin to race. She stood up and walked to the front of the courtroom with quiet confidence, carrying her briefcase full of carefully prepared evidence. She had practiced what she would say and felt ready to present her case clearly and professionally. Judge Hayes looked down at his papers and began reading in a monotone voice. Emma Thompson, you are charged with speeding and failure to comply with officer instructions. How do you plead? Emma stood straight and spoke clearly. Not guilty, Your Honor. I'd like to present evidence that shows I was driving within the speed limit and that I fully cooperated with the officer. She began to open her briefcase, expecting to be given the opportunity to present her evidence, just as she had seen in countless other courtrooms during her career. But Judge Hayes raised his hand and waved dismissively. "I've heard enough," he said, not even looking up from Officer Collins' report. "The officer's report is clear and detailed. Officer Collins is a veteran with an excellent record. I see no reason to question his professional judgment." Emma felt confused and disappointed. She had not yet been given the chance to speak or present any of her evidence. "Your Honor, if I may, I have witnesses who can testify about my driving that morning, and I have documentation that shows the officer's report is sufficient." Judge Hayes interrupted again, this time sounding slightly irritated. "I'm imposing a fine of $800 and 40 hours of community service. This will teach you to respect law enforcement officers and follow traffic laws properly." Emma stood quietly for a moment, absorbing the quick judgment. The whole proceeding had taken less than 90 seconds. She had hoped for a fair hearing, a chance to present her evidence, and an opportunity to explain what had really happened that morning. But it was clear that Judge Hayes had already made up his mind before she even spoke. The courtroom felt very quiet as Emma processed what had just happened. She looked round and saw other defendants waiting for their cases, some looking worried, others resigned to their fate. She realized that what she was experiencing was probably typical of how this courtroom operated every day. "Your Honor," Emma said calmly, her voice steady despite her disappointment, "I'd like to file an appeal." Judge Hayes looked up for the first time during the entire proceeding, and Emma could see slight annoyance in his eyes. He clearly was not used to defendants questioning his decisions or requesting appeals. "That's—" "You're right," he said curtly. "The clerk will give you the forms. Next case." As Emma walked toward the clerk's desk, she could hear Judge Hayes already calling the next defendant. She felt disappointed but not defeated. Throughout her academic career, she had studied cases of rushed judgment and judicial bias, but experiencing it firsthand was completely different. The theory she taught in her classroom had become a painful reality. Emma collected the appeal forms from the clerk, a kind older woman who gave her a sympathetic look. As she left the courtroom, Emma felt the weight of injustice, but she also felt something else. She still believed in the system's ability to correct itself, even when individuals within it fell short of their duties. Use a warm, empathetic tone to woe months after Emma's court appearance. Judge Hayes sat in his oak-paneled chambers on a dreary December afternoon. The room was filled with law books that reached from floor to ceiling, and his large wooden desk was covered with case files that seemed to multiply each day. Outside his window, bare tree branches swayed in the winter wind, and the gray sky matched his mood as he prepared for a particularly challenging case. The upcoming lawsuit involved a local restaurant that had been accused of discriminating against customers based on their race. The case was complicated, and Judge Hayes knew he needed to understand all the legal precedents before making any decisions. He had always prided himself on being thorough when it came to important cases, even though he preferred to handle routine matters quickly. As he read through the thick stack of supporting documents, legal briefs, and expert opinions, one name kept appearing over and over again: Dr. Emma Thompson. Judge Hayes noticed that this Dr. Thompson was cited frequently in discussions about constitutional law and civil rights cases. Her work appeared in footnotes, reference lists, and even in the main arguments of several briefs. At first, Judge Hayes paid little attention to the name. He saw hundreds of legal experts cited in cases every year, and most names meant nothing to him personally. But as he continued reading, he began to notice something unusual. This Emma Thompson was not just mentioned occasionally. She was referenced as a leading authority on issues of judicial bias and fair treatment under the law. Curious about this expert whose work seemed so relevant to the case, Judge Hayes decided to learn more. He opened his computer and searched for Dr. Emma Thompson constitutional law. What he found made him sit up straighter in his leather chair. Dr. Emma Thompson was described as one of the most respected legal scholars in the state, with over 20 years of experience teaching and researching civil rights law. Judge Hayes clicked through several academic websites and news articles. He learned that Dr. Thompson had written extensively about judicial bias, procedural fairness, and the importance of giving every person their day in court. Her research had been published in the most prestigious law journals in the country. She had received numerous awards for her work on civil rights, and her opinions had been quoted by the Supreme Court itself. As Judge Hayes continued reading, he felt a growing sense of unease. The name Emma Thompson was starting to sound familiar, but he could not quite place where he had heard it before. He had processed thousands of cases over his 15 years on the bench, and most defendants blended together in his memory. Then Judge Hayes decided to look at Dr. Thompson's university profile page. When the page loaded and he saw her photograph, his stomach dropped like a stone. The professional headshot showed a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, wearing academic robes from her graduation ceremony. It was definitely the same woman who had stood in his courtroom just 2 months earlier. Judge Hayes stared at the photograph on his computer screen, feeling a mix of shock and shame wash over him. Emma Thompson was not just any defendant who had appeared before his bench. She was one of the most respected legal scholars in the state, someone whose expertise in constitutional law far exceeded his own. She had dedicated her entire career to fighting for the very principles of justice and fairness that he had failed to uphold in his courtroom. Judge Hayes clicked back to her published papers and began reading some of her work. One article was titled "The Danger of Quick Judgments: How Rushed Court Proceedings Undermine Justice." Another paper discussed implicit bias in the courtroom, when judges stop seeing the person. As he read her words, Judge Hayes felt as if she was speaking directly to him, describing exactly what he had done to her. In one particularly powerful passage, Dr. Thompson had written, "When judges fail to listen to defendants and make decisions based on assumptions rather than evidence, they not only harm the individual before them, but they damage the entire system of justice that depends on fairness and respect for all people." Judge Hayes leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed by the realization of what he had done. He had let his assumptions and his rushed schedule prevent him from seeing the person standing before him. He had treated Dr. Thompson as just another case, to be processed quickly, never bothering to really look at her or listen to what she had to say. He had failed not just Emma, but the very ideals of justice he had sworn to protect when he became a judge. That night, Judge Hayes lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Emma's case. But more than that, he found himself thinking about all the other defendants who had stood before his bench over the years. How many others had he misjudged? How many people had he failed to see as full human beings deserving of respect and fairness? Emma's case had become like a mirror, showing him uncomfortable truths about his own biases and failures. For the first time in years, Judge Hayes questioned whether he was the fair and impartial judge he had always believed himself to be. Use a warm, empathetic tone the next morning. Judge Hayes arrived at his chambers earlier than usual. He had barely slept the night before, and his mind kept returning to the discovery about Dr. Emma Thompson. The first thing he did was call the court clerk and request the official transcript from Emma's hearing 2 months ago. He needed to see his own words written down to understand exactly what had happened in his courtroom that day. When the transcript arrived an hour later, Judge Hayes sat down at his desk with a heavy heart and began to read. The typed pages showed every word that had been spoken during Emma's brief appearance before his bench. As he read his own responses, Judge Hayes felt a deep sense of shame washing over him. His words seemed cold and dismissive on the page, lacking any warmth or genuine interest in hearing what Emma had to say. The transcript showed that Emma had tried 3 different times to present evidence about her case. Each time, Judge Hayes had interrupted her or dismissed her attempts. He had not asked her any questions about what happened that morning, and he had not shown any curiosity about her side of the story, the evidence she had wanted to present would have clearly shown her innocence, but he had never given her the chance to share it. Reading the transcript was like looking in a mirror and seeing an unflattering reflection of himself. Judge Hayes realized that he had been impatient, dismissive, and completely closed to the possibility that the police officer might have been wrong. He had treated Emma as if she was guilty before she even spoke, and he had rushed through her case as if it was just another item on his daily schedule. Meanwhile, across town at the university, Emma stood before her constitutional law class in the bright lecture hall where she had taught for nearly a decade. The room was filled with eager young students who respected her knowledge and appreciated her ability to make complex legal concepts easy to understand. Today's lesson was about systemic bias in the justice system, a topic that had become deeply personal for her after her recent experience. Emma looked out at the 30 students sitting in the tiered seats, their notebooks open and pens ready. She had always believed that education was the key to creating positive change in society, and she hoped that these future lawyers would remember her lessons when they began their own careers. Can anyone tell me what happens when judges make quick decisions without fully considering the evidence? Emma asked her students, her voice warm and encouraging as always. A student named James, who sat in the front row and always participated actively in class discussions, raised his hand eagerly. It leads to unfair outcomes, Professor Thompson. People might be punished for things they didn't do, or the real problems in cases might be ignored. Emma nodded approvingly. That's exactly right, James. But here's a more challenging question for all of you. How do we fix a system when the people in power don't want to change or don't even realize they need to change? The classroom fell quiet. As students thought about this difficult question, Emma could see them struggling with the complexity of the issue. Finally, James raised his hand again, looking uncertain. That's really hard, Professor Thompson. If judges and other powerful people don't see the problem, how can we make them understand? Emma smiled gently at her students, feeling a mixture of hope and sadness. Change often starts with education and understanding. Sometimes, those in power need to experience injustice themselves before they can truly understand how it affects others. She paused for a moment, looking round the room at the young faces staring back at her. Emma had always tried to keep her personal experiences separate from her teaching, but she felt that sharing her story might help her students understand these concepts better. Recently, I experienced bias in a courtroom, Emma said quietly. I was judged not on the facts of my case, but on assumptions about who I was and whether I belonged there. The judge made quick decisions without listening to what I had to say. The class listened intently as Emma described her experience, though she was careful not to mention any names or specific details that might identify the people involved. She talked about how it felt to be dismissed and not heard, and how the experience had affected her both personally and professionally. The officer who stopped me made assumptions about me based on my appearance, Emma continued. The judge who heard my case was more interested in moving quickly through his schedule than in listening to my evidence. Both of them failed to see me as a complete person deserving of respect and fairness. Emma could see that her students were moved by her story. Some leaned forward in their seats, and others took notes about what she was saying. She felt proud that she could use her difficult experience to teach them important lessons about justice. The most powerful response to injustice, Emma concluded, is not anger or revenge, but the commitment to ensure it doesn't happen to others. We can use our experiences to create positive change in the world. Back in his chambers, Judge Hayes finished reading the transcript and made a decision that surprised even himself. He picked up his phone and dialed the university's main number, asking to speak with Dr. Emma Thompson. His hands shook slightly as he waited for the call to be transferred. User warm. Empathetic Tony Ma was grading papers in her office when her phone rang that Thursday afternoon. She looked at the caller ID and saw it was from the courthouse. Her first thought was that there might be some problem with her appeal. But when she answered, she heard a voice she recognized but had never expected to hear again. Dr. Thompson. "This is Judge Hayes," the voice said quietly. Emma was surprised to hear from him, but she was even more surprised by how different he sounded. Gone was the stern, impatient tone she remembered from the courtroom. Instead, his voice was humble, almost fragile, as if he was struggling to find the right words. "I was wondering if we could meet." Judge Hayes continued, "I have something important I need to discuss with you. Would you be willing to have coffee with me sometime this week?" Something in his tone told Emma that this was not just a routine legal matter. She could hear genuine emotion in his voice, and despite everything that had happened, she felt curious about what he wanted to say. "Of course, Judge Hayes, when would be convenient for you?" They arranged to meet the next day at a small cafe called Miller's Corner, located just a few blocks from the university campus. Emma had eaten lunch there many times with her colleagues, and she knew it would be a quiet, comfortable place for whatever conversation Judge Hayes wanted to have. The next afternoon, Emma arrived at the cafe a few minutes early and chose a corner table away from the other customers. When Judge Hayes walked through the door, Emma was struck by how different he looked from the imposing figure she remembered from the courtroom. He appeared older somehow, and his usual stern demeanor had been replaced by something that looked very much like genuine remorse. Judge Hayes approached the table slowly, as if he was not sure he deserved to be there. "Dr. Thompson, thank you for agreeing to meet with me," he said as he sat down across from her. His hands were shaking slightly as he placed them on the table. "Please, call me Emma," she replied gently, trying to put him at ease despite her own uncertainty about why they were meeting. Judge Hayes took a deep breath and looked directly into her eyes. "Emma, I owe you an apology. I failed you as a judge, and I failed the principles of justice I swore to uphold when I took this position 15 years ago." Emma listened quietly as Judge Hayes explained how he had discovered her work while researching another case. He told her about reading her academic papers and realizing that she was one of the most respected legal scholars in the state. He described the shame he felt when he understood that he had dismissed someone whose expertise in constitutional law far exceeded his own. "I read the transcript from your hearing," Judge Hayes continued, his voice breaking slightly. "I was dismissive, impatient, and completely close to hearing what you had to say. The evidence you wanted to present would have clearly shown your innocence, but I never gave you the chance to share it." Emma could see the genuine pain in his eyes as he spoke. This was not a man trying to protect himself or make excuses. This was someone who had truly recognized his mistakes and was struggling to understand how he had let them happen. "Judge Hayes," Emma said gently, "I appreciate your apology. It takes courage to admit when we've made mistakes, especially in positions of authority. But what matters most is what we do moving forward." Judge Hayes leaned forward, his expression hopeful for the first time since he had arrived. "I want to do better, Emma. I want to learn. Would you be willing to help me understand how to address bias in the courtroom? I realize now that I've probably misjudged many people over the years, and I don't want to continue making these same mistakes." Emma smiled for the first time during their conversation. This was the moment she had hoped for, though she had never really expected it to happen. Not revenge, but redemption. Not punishment, but the possibility of positive change. I'd be honored to help you, Judge Hayes, over the following months. Emma and Judge Hayes began working together to develop a comprehensive training program for judges. About unconscious bias, they spent countless hours researching, writing, and creating workshops that would help legal professionals recognize their assumptions and learn to treat all people with equal dignity regardless of either appearance or background. Judge Hayes also took immediate action regarding Emma's case. He officially overturned her conviction and publicly acknowledged the error in his judgment. But more importantly, he began changing how he approached every case that came before his bench. He started taking time to truly listen to each person who appeared before him, asking questions and showing genuine interest in understanding their situations. Emma watched with growing pride as other judges throughout the county began adopting their training methods. What had started as a personal injustice had become a catalyst for a positive change throughout the entire legal system. Their program was soon being used in courtrooms across the state, and other legal professionals were asking for copies of their materials at the program's first graduation ceremony 6 months later. Judge Hayes stood before a room full of his fellow judges and spoke from his heart. Justice isn't just about following the law, he said, his voice strong and clear. It's about seeing the humanity in every person who seeks it. Emma sat in the audience, nodding with approval and feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. She knew that sometimes the most profound changes come from the most unexpected places. The end.